That morning I woke up thinking it would be like any other winter day. Cold air, the scent of pine drifting through the trees, and the simple pleasure of getting a fire going in the living room. It's a ritual I looked forward to, splitting logs, stacking them just right, and hearing that first crackle as the flames catch. But when I stepped outside to grab a few logs, I stopped cold. The entire stack was gone. Not a single piece of firewood was left. Just yesterday, I had spent nearly an hour stacking it all, lining up the pieces so they'd stay dry, ready for the colder weeks ahead. But now, it had vanished. I stood there staring at the empty space for a long minute, wondering if I was losing my mind. Had I moved it somewhere else and forgotten? No chance. I remembered the work, the care I took. Somebody had taken it. Not a few logs. All of it. Right down to the last little chunk. Annoyance turned into suspicion. I stomped back into the house, straight for my laptop. I had security cameras set up outside, mostly to keep raccoons from knocking over my trash cans, but if one of those little bandits had developed a taste for firewood, I wanted to see it for myself. What I found on the footage made my stomach twist. There she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed ruler of our HOA. You know the type, perfectly ironed clothes, that permanent expression like she's constantly smelling something rotten. And there she was, marching right up to my firewood in broad daylight, waving her arms like some kind of dictator issuing orders. She wasn't alone either. She had two guys with her, movers from the looks of it. And they were hauling every last log into the back of a truck while she stood there supervising, like she was doing me some kind of favor. She didn't try to sneak around, didn't check to see if anyone was watching. She just took it, like it was hers to take. Watching her on that screen, with that smug look, something in me snapped. I knew exactly how this was going to play out. She'd twist it into something about the HOA rules, claim it was for community safety, or some garbage about maintaining the neighborhood aesthetic. Karen loved her rules, especially the ones she made up on the spot. I wasn't about to let it slide. I slammed the laptop shut, grabbed my jacket, and headed straight for her place. It wasn't hard to find. Her house was the one with the oversized flagpole, a mailbox that gleamed like it had just been waxed, and flower beds so precise they could have been measured with a ruler. Before I even knocked, the door swung open. Karen stood there, her face already set in that tight smile people like her think looks polite, but you can tell it's just barely hiding her annoyance. "Well, Jake," she said like I'd just dropped by to borrow sugar. "What a surprise." "You can skip the act," I told her. "Explain why you stole my firewood." Karen let out a little laugh, like I was a child throwing a tantrum over a toy. "Stole? That's an awfully harsh word, don't you think?" "I repurposed it, for the benefit of the community." I crossed my arms. "Repurposed? That was my firewood. I bought it, I stacked it, and now it's gone." She tilted her head, looking at me like I'd failed some kind of test. "Jake, the HOA has standards. Your firewood wasn't properly stored. It disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. I did you a favor by removing it." "It was behind my house," I snapped. "No one could even see it." She waved a hand. "That's not the point. We needed more firewood for the HOA bonfire. Your stack was the closest, and frankly, I didn't have time to wait for you to offer." I felt my jaw clench. "So you just helped yourself." Karen sighed. "Jake, it's just firewood. You can always get more." And there it was. That tone, like I was the unreasonable one here, like I was making a scene over nothing. But I wasn't going to let her twist this around, not this time. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "You've made your choice." She smiled that fake smile again. "Oh, Jake, always so dramatic." I turned away without another word. But inside, my mind was already racing. Karen had spent years running the neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. She set the rules, broke them when it suited her, and expected everyone to thank her for it. But this time, she'd gone too far. I walked straight to my garage, grabbed a notepad, and started sketching out a plan. Something devious. Something perfect. You see, Karen had taken my firewood, but I still had a few logs she hadn't gotten her claws on yet, and I had time. More importantly, I had motivation. It didn't take long to gather what I needed: hollow logs, carefully crafted entry points, and a container filled with one of nature's most determined little soldiers, fire ants, nasty little things, with a sting that'd make you rethink every choice you'd made up until that moment. I spent hours getting everything ready. Each hollowed out log was a perfect replica of the ones Karen had taken. Same size, same weight. The ants were tucked inside, waiting. And the best part? They wouldn't leave until the heat from the fire drove them out in a frenzy. By the time I was finished, I was almost impressed with myself. The plan was airtight. All I needed was for Karen to do exactly what I knew she would. And sure enough, the next morning, she took the bait. I was sitting by the window, drinking coffee, watching her march across my lawn like she owned it. There she was, ordering her movers to load up my fresh stack of logs. She didn't even glance toward the house, just waved her hand like a queen granting herself permission. I watched the truck drive away, my heart beating steady. Now it was just a matter of time. That evening, the entire neighborhood gathered for the annual HOA bonfire, the event Karen loved to lord over. She was front and center, microphone in hand, smiling like she hadn't just stolen from half the people in attendance. "We're all here tonight because of our wonderful community spirit," she said, her voice echoing across the crowd. "And thanks to a little extra effort, we have plenty of firewood to keep us warm." I stayed near the back, waiting. She made a show of picking up one of my hollowed logs, lifting it above her head like she was presenting an offering to the gods. Then she tossed it into the flames. For a few moments, it was just a normal bonfire. The wood crackled, the flames danced. Karen basked in the applause, soaking up the attention like a sponge. Then it started. At first, a few ants, confused and desperate, crawled from the log's seams. Karen didn't notice, but soon, dozens, then hundreds, began to pour out. It didn't take long before the ground around the fire was swarming. The first scream came from someone standing nearby. Then another. Karen noticed then. She looked down to find ants racing up her legs, biting, stinging. She shrieked and jumped back, flailing her arms, slapping at her clothes. But it was too late. The ants were everywhere. People scattered. Some tipped over chairs. Others dropped their drinks. Chaos erupted in seconds. Karen spun around, still screaming, and crashed straight into the refreshment table. A huge bowl of cider dumped over her, soaking her completely. And still, the ants kept coming. She ran, blindly, knocking over anything in her path. At one point, she slipped on a plate of marshmallows, and they stuck to her clothes like glue. Now she was wet, sticky, and covered in angry ants. Nobody helped. Not right away. Everyone just stood there, too stunned, or maybe too entertained, to do much of anything. Then, without thinking, Karen bolted straight for the lake at the edge of the park. She didn't hesitate. She dove in headfirst with a splash that echoed across the clearing. When she surfaced, hair plastered to her face, her perfectly pressed outfit ruined, the crowd couldn't hold it in anymore. Laughter erupted. Even the HOA vice president, Barbara, was doubled over, wiping tears from her eyes. Karen dragged herself out of the water, dripping and humiliated. She didn't make a speech, didn't say a word. She just stomped to her car, got in, and drove away. And just like that, the queen of the HOA was dethroned.
The bonfire continued, though people couldn't stop talking about what had just happened. I stood there with my cider, watching the flames, knowing exactly how it had all unfolded. A few neighbors gave me looks. They didn't say anything, but their smiles told me they understood. Karen had ruled over us for too long. She thought she was untouchable. That night, she found out just how wrong she was. And I wasn't finished yet. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Whispers, text threads, side conversations. You couldn't walk down the street without hearing someone bring it up. The story was already growing legs, like these things always do. Some said Karen had screamed so loud it set off car alarms. Others swore she'd swallowed a marshmallow whole while flailing around and nearly choked to death. No two versions were exactly the same, but every single one ended with Karen soaking wet, covered in sticky goop, and fire ants running for her life. I let them talk. Every retelling made her look a little more ridiculous, and I was fine with that. Karen herself, though, gone. Her house, usually so busy it was like living next to a train station, was completely still. No one saw her pacing by the window, no HOA flyers taped to anyone's door. The endless stream of emails about proper garbage bin placement and lawn trimming violations stopped cold. It was like she'd vanished, but I knew better. She wasn't gone. She was licking her wounds, plotting her next move. And by the afternoon, sure enough, she struck. An email, subject line in bold red letters, urgent HOA meeting, attendance mandatory. The message was peak Karen, dramatic, self-important, and full of legal-sounding threats. Gross misconduct, severe violations of community safety, a direct attack on neighborhood harmony. It was all there. She was gearing up for a full-blown witch hunt, and she wanted everyone to know it. There wasn't a doubt in my mind what she was going to try and pull. Paint herself as the victim, shift the blame, spin the whole thing into some conspiracy against her. I wasn't worried. She was desperate now, and when people like Karen get desperate, they get sloppy. The meeting was scheduled for 6 sharp at the community center. By the time I showed up, the place was packed. People crammed shoulder to shoulder, standing room only. There was an energy in the air, like everyone knew they were about to witness something big. A few people nodded at me as I walked in. Some smiled, barely holding it back. We all knew why we were there, and so did Karen. She was already seated at the front of the room. But she didn't look like the same woman who'd swanned around that bonfire the night before. Her usually perfect hair was still a little frizzy, probably from its impromptu swim. Her smile was tight, like she was trying to glue herself back together in real time. She cleared her throat and launched into her speech. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. Her voice was sharper than usual, the edge cutting through the room like a knife. "We have a very serious issue to address. Last night's bonfire was unacceptable, an embarrassment to our community, and it was the result of a deliberate act of vandalism." She paused, letting it hang there like she expected gasps. Instead, silence. A few people exchanged glances. Somewhere near the back, someone stifled a laugh. Karen pressed on, undeterred. Someone in this very community tampered with the firewood used in our event. They placed infested logs into the pile, resulting in chaos, injury, and damage to the HOA's reputation. This was a targeted attack. On me, and by extension, all of you. And there it was, Karen's version of the truth. She was the victim. We were supposed to rally behind her, demand justice, and restore her throne. But no one was buying it. Barbara, the HOA vice president, stood up slowly from her seat. She was an older woman, usually quiet, but when she spoke, people listened. "Karen," she said calmly, "before we go tossing around accusations, maybe we should talk about how the firewood ended up there in the first place." Karen blinked. "What are you implying?" Barbara folded her hands in front of her. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but you took that firewood from Jake's backyard, didn't you? Without asking?" The murmurs swelled into a low hum as people started to connect the dots out loud. Karen's face tightened. "I removed it because it was a violation. His woodpile didn't meet HOA standards." Barbara raised an eyebrow. "Which standard is that exactly?" "Because I've read the handbook from cover to cover. There's nothing in there about firewood storage." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. From the crowd, old Mr. Thompson's voice rang out. "Sounds like you stole it to me?" More murmurs. Then outright laughter. Karen scrambled to regain control. "I was acting in the best interest of the community. We needed wood for the bonfire. And you just helped yourself to it?" Barbara replied. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Someone else called out, "You fined me last summer for having wind chimes." Another shouted, "She made my daughter take down her lemonade stand." "I got a citation for using solar lights," another woman said. The room was boiling over now. Years of frustration finally spilling out into the open. Karen tried to talk over them, raising her voice. "You don't understand." But no one cared. The spell was broken. She wasn't in charge anymore. She was just another neighbor, scrambling to defend herself. Barbara cleared her throat, loud enough to quiet everyone down. I move to hold a vote, she announced. Effective immediately. Vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then hands shot up, one after another, faster than Karen could even process what was happening. It wasn't close. Not even a little. Karen stood there, frozen, watching the room turn against her. You're making a mistake, she said, voice trembling now. You need me. But it was over. The vote was cast. Barbara turned to her. You're dismissed. Karen's face darkened, her hands clenched at her sides. Then she let out this half growl, half scream of frustration, and stormed out of the room. The doors slammed behind her like a gunshot. For a second, no one said anything. Then cheers, loud, triumphant. Someone popped open a soda can like it was champagne. The entire place erupted into celebration, and just like that, Karen's reign was over. Later that night, I sat out on my porch with a mug of cider in my hand. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp against the black. I had a small fire going, a legal, regulation-compliant fire, and a few neighbors stopped by to join me. No formal invitations, no rules. Just people who were finally breathing easy for the first time in years. It felt different, lighter. The HOA, stripped of its tyrant, was starting to feel like a neighborhood again. Someone handed me a toasted marshmallow on a stick. To justice, they said, and I raised my mug in agreement. To peace and quiet, someone else added. I smiled. To common sense. That fire crackled for hours. Nobody was rushing to leave. There was no clipboard circulating, no forms to fill out, no Karen peeking through blinds and taking notes. She was gone, and honestly, it felt good. Over the next few days, things started to shift in ways big and small. Neighbors who never used to talk were suddenly chatting at their mailboxes. People offered to help one another out, fixing a fence here, moving a couch there. Little things, but they added up. Even the HOA meetings felt different. No lectures, no fines for having a doormat that wasn't neutral beige. Just folks sitting around talking about what actually mattered. And Karen, well, no one really knew. She kept to herself after that. Rumor was she was spending more time at her sister's place in the next town over. Some said she was plotting a comeback. Others thought she might sell her house and move on. Me? I didn't care it either way. The balance had shifted. The neighborhood had found its voice, and it wasn't about to give that up again. One Saturday afternoon, a few weeks later, I was working in the yard when Barbara stopped by. Hey, she said, I was thinking about organizing a block party. Nothing fancy. Potluck, maybe a little music. I nodded. Sounds good, she smiled. You know, I don't think we've had one since Karen took over. I chuckled. Probably against the rules. Barbara laughed, shaking her head. Well, those days are done. And they were. The block party happened 2 weeks later. Tables lined the street, covered with every kind of dish you could think of. Kids ran around, chasing each other with water balloons. Someone set up a little speaker system and played old classic rock tracks. People danced in their driveways, laughing, talking like they'd known each other for years. It wasn't perfect. It was better. And late that night, after everyone had gone home and the street was quiet again, I sat out on my porch one more time. The fire was low, just embers now. But the warmth was still there. I took a deep breath, looking out at the neighborhood I'd fought for. A place that finally felt like home. Karen may have started the war, but she never saw it through. She underestimated all of us. And in the end, her greatest downfall wasn't a prank or a swarm of ants. It was thinking she was the only one who mattered, but not anymore. And as I tossed the last log onto the embers and watched the flames rise again, I knew one thing for certain. This time, they were mine, and no one was ever going to take them again.